In this video, we will provide historical evidence and reasoning to show that Christianity is true. We will focus specifically on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Here is a bare bones outline of the historical case for the resurrection. Many followers of Jesus claimed that Jesus was God, at least in some sense, and that he proved it by returning from the dead, never to die again. They claimed to see this. They proved their honesty by being willing to face death repeatedly for making this claim. There you have a very basic general summary of the historical case for Christianity. Rather than give you a host of reasons to believe it, I prefer to merely make comparisons. I find that most people have already heard a case made for the truth of the resurrection, etc. And over I find that people reject this case for the same reason. They always have some other similar example, situation, and story. They claim that if your evidence proves Christianity true, then the same methods could prove other religions or any set of wild ideas true. This type of refutation is called the reduction to absurdity. That is our introduction to this video. With that out of the way, let's simply begin to look at examples. Jim Jones cult suicide. On November 18, 1978, 918 members of the Jim Jones cult drank poison Kool-Aid at their compound in Venezuela. Hundreds of sane, rational people committed suicide at the request of a clearly deranged cult leader. If the apostles' willingness to die makes their claims about Jesus true, then does the cult members' deaths for their beliefs make the message of Jim Jones also true? Response: the two situations are not the same. The Jonestown cult considered suicide their last-ditch effort to reveal the evil capitalist system to the world. In other words, they were conspiracy theorists, but they had no way of really knowing if their theories were true. While it is clear that they sincerely believed them, they had no way of knowing if it was true. In fact, they never claimed to have actually spied on any meetings where the evil corporations all met and planned the fate of the world. Therefore, they didn't know if the conspiracy theory wasn't true either. With the followers of Jesus, they claim to actually witness Jesus alive. They also claim to witness his previous ministry. Therefore, they would have been willing to die for something they would have known to be false. That is, if it is indeed false. This is a very different situation. Ancient mythology. There are many ancient myths of heroes, gods, and demigods performing incredible feats. Bellerophon rode the winged horse Pegasus to battle and defeat the monstrous fire-breathing Chimera. He was even from the real ancient Greek city of Corinth. So if you believe the story of Jesus returning from the dead, then why not Bellerophon? Response: the stories of Bellerophon are legends. In other words, they are written many centuries after the events supposedly occurred. They come to us in written documents. The authors simply pass on to us what was a story people were telling. When it comes to the stories of Jesus, there are documents that actually claim to be from eyewitnesses. Paul claims in his writings to have seen Jesus alive. The author of John's Gospel claims to be an eyewitness. Luke wrote both Luke and Acts. In Acts, Luke writes some of it as though he were present, so he too claims to be an eyewitness many times over. He says, "We went here and we went there" with Paul on various missionary journeys. In Luke's introduction to both letters, he claims to be compiling various stories that are obtained from eyewitnesses which he has investigated, obviously combining them with his own first-hand experiences. Luke tells us that these stories of Jesus come from those who were eyewitnesses at the start. He then adds that he is writing because he himself has carefully investigated everything. So he makes it clear that he is not an eyewitness from the beginning. Furthermore, he makes it clear in Acts that he has direct access to eyewitnesses. Many portions of Luke are so similar to Matthew and Mark that they must have a common source, or else one of them is the source. This would mean that Luke is also claiming Matthew and Mark contain eyewitness accounts, at least as far as he is similar with them. Thus, the written documents which claim Jesus' resurrection also claim to be sourced directly from eyewitnesses. But ancient mythology is different. It claims to be sourced from centuries-old handed-down stories. Bereavement visions. According to this article, it is very common for people who have lost a loved one to experience visions of the dead person now alive. These are especially common when the death was unexpected, just as with Jesus. According to a study in Sweden, half of elderly widows or widowers feel the presence of the dead person, and 1/3 see, hear, or talk to the deceased. If you believe that the followers of Jesus saw him back from the dead, then why not believe all of these stories as well? Or are all of these just a hallucination? Response. If bereavement visions are such a common experience, then the followers of Jesus would have concluded that they merely had a bereavement vision too. Something much different is needed to explain why they founded a new religious movement. They risked their lives regularly for their message. Muhammad founded Islam. The Prophet Muhammad claimed to have numerous experiences where angels gave him messages from God. These led him to found one of the world's largest religions, Islam. So if you believe the Christians' visions of a risen Jesus are true, then why not also believe in Islam? Response. Muhammad did found a religion, but he did not risk his life for the message. He did put his life in danger due to his religious movement, but these were military expeditions and not merely spreading his doctrines. So he had an added motivation for land, money, or even escaping revenge for his military actions. Socrates. Socrates was executed for his teachings. The Athenian council said his teachings were corrupting the youth. He knew he would get into trouble for his teachings, and yet he was willing to continue, and apparently accepted his execution while defiantly continuing to spread his message. This was the origin of Platonism, a philosophy that was essentially a major religious movement for centuries. So if you believe in Jesus because of the martyrdom of the apostles, then why not also be a Platonist? For Socrates was also a very willing martyr who founded a religion. Response. Socrates did not base his philosophy on any visions or observations of any miracles. Rather, he grounded all of it in very complicated logic and reasoning. There is a huge amount of room for him to make mistakes and come to false conclusions. The Christians relied on their own observations of Jesus' ministry and resurrection. Still, they did have to use a bit of reasoning also, but for them it was very simple. Jesus made numerous fantastic claims about himself. He was the long-awaited Messiah, God's anointed King of Israel that would free them from oppression and lead them in the world into peace and righteousness. He was a prophet with an actual messages directly from God, and he was even God. If a man makes such claims falsely, then we would think he should be refuted publicly, denounced, etc. In Jesus' case, he was executed as a criminal in public disgrace. But then if he actually comes back from the dead, it appears God is affirming Jesus' radical claims. If the devil or some magical being brought Jesus back, then we have to blame God for allowing us to be misled so dramatically. Unlike Socrates, the reasoning for the apostles is very simple indeed. That is, given of course that God exists, which is a different and separate question. Apollonius of Tyana. This excerpt comes from Dr. Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? Even before he was born, it was known that he would be someone special. A supernatural being informed his mother that the child she was to conceive would not be a mere mortal, but would be divine. He was born miraculously, and he became an unusually precocious young man. As an adult, he left home and went on an itinerant preaching ministry, urging his listeners to live not for the material things of this world, but for what is spiritual. He gathered a number of disciples around him who became convinced that his teachings were divinely inspired, in no small part because he himself was divine. He proved it to them by doing many miracles, healing the sick, casting out demons, and raising the dead. At the end of his life, he roused opposition, and his enemies delivered him over to the Roman authorities for judgment. Still, after he left this world, he returned to meet his followers in order to convince them that he was not really dead but lived on in the heavenly realm. Later, some of his followers wrote books about him. End of quote. So if you believe in Jesus, then why not also believe in Apollonius? Response. Apollonius was a Neo-Pythagorean philosopher and a contemporary of Jesus. He was reviving a religious movement / philosophy that predated Socrates. While debates existed among the various philosophical schools, belonging to one didn't get you into any danger of execution. In other words, nobody faced execution for their beliefs regarding Apollonius. Heaven's Gate. In 1997, 39 members of the Heaven's Gate cult committed a ritual suicide. They believed that they were transporting up to a spaceship that was arriving behind the Hale-Bopp comet. Everyone remember Hale-Bopp? The cult had a 22-year history and had been in the evening news before. They were composed of people who filled their minds with all sorts of different religious, spiritual, magical, and science fiction ideas for decades. They called this period their time in the classroom. The founding members, a man and woman, believed that they would be killed, returned to life, and transported onto a spaceship. This would prove their beliefs to the world. The group originally taught that they would all be transported bodily onto the spaceship with the aliens. But the founding woman died in 1987. The other, male founder, subsequently changed the doctrines to say that the body dies and the inner self journeys up to the spaceship. This group sacrificed their possessions and made a destitute journey across the country. They begged for money along the way. And of course they clearly believed their message when they drank the poison. So if you believe Jesus resurrected because of the commitment of his followers, then why not also believe in Heaven's Gate? Response. All of the members of the Heaven's Gate cult came from people who had filled their minds with similar ideas for longer than they had been members. After decades of that, it's not hard to believe that their imaginations were playing tricks on them. They could have easily lost their grip on reality and hallucinated all sorts of things. This is not the same as the followers of Jesus. The accounts of Jesus' life claim his followers had no notion that Jesus would ever be killed by the enemies of Israel. In fact, they rejected that idea when Jesus himself really did try to tell them. A key study on mass hallucinations is Leonard Zusny and Warren Jones' Animalistic Psychology, a study of extraordinary phenomena of behavior and experience, Hillsdale, New Jersey, Lawrence Erlbaum, 1982. According to this study, expectation and emotional excitement are prerequisites for group hallucinations. Expectation is said to play the coordinating role among group members. Without that, then people would not all hallucinate the same thing. Think of it. Jesus appears at the same time to multiple people. He says the same thing. Then he leaves at the same time. If it was a hallucination, then they had to be already excitedly expecting it. And the point for the Christians is that they did not expect Jesus to die or come back. What proves this point is the non-existence of any accounts of Christians who did expect the crucifixion and resurrection. What if Jesus had been successful at filling their minds with this message? Or what if they had got the idea from some other source? Wouldn't the Christians who already predicted Jesus' death and subsequent return be the leaders among the new group? Why would the Christians who were right all along be the ones that get forgotten? Wouldn't they be the most remembered founders and leaders? The 11 witnesses of Joseph Smith. In the early 1800s, 11 men went on written record with a claim to have seen various fantastic things related to the religious doctrines of Joseph Smith. They saw an angel that showed them golden plates from which Smith translated the Book of Mormon. Thus we have numerous independent, early accounts claiming to have seen a miraculous vision to verify Mormonism. In fact, their accounts date to possibly the very same year of the visions, which is far earlier than the decades that passed before the New Testament was written. So if you believe in Christianity, then why not also become a Mormon? Response. While the accounts of Joseph Smith's 11 witnesses is very well recorded and very early, it fails on every other important measurement. First, none of these men went to their deaths for any of this. In fact, half of the witnesses were excommunicated from Joseph's church. Regarding 3 of them, Joseph said they were, quote, too mean to mention, and we had like to have forgotten them, end of quote. If Smith doubts their credibility, then how can their testimony be used to prove his own? Some of them joined other denominations. Some eventually returned to the Mormon Church. 3 of them were his father and brothers. His father had originally encouraged Smith to seek out such visions. To make matters worse, they were all already believers in the existence of the golden plates and Smith's angelic visitor. So it's obviously clear their imaginations could have been playing tricks on them. Worst of all is that all of them were also well documented to believe in something called second sight. This is the ability to see something which is not physically there. In other words, they may have merely meant that they saw everything in their minds. Mass hallucinations of Mary. There are many examples where groups of people reported seeing visions of Jesus' mother Mary. In 1879 in Ireland, 15 people reported seeing Mary on one occasion. There are many other examples. So if one believes the visionary experiences of Jesus' followers are real, then why not also believe in the sightings of Mary? Response. For starters, belief in Christianity does not commit one to rejecting belief in visions of Mary. It's not the same as Muhammad's conversations with angels that tell him to reject the idea that Jesus ever died. But more importantly, these visions were experienced by people who were already in expectation of having such visions. So we run into the same hallucination problem as before. The difference with the apostles is the lack of expectation. And there's no reason for any of these witnesses to have died for their beliefs. While regrettable, the apostles signed their statements in their own blood. The secondary question: did the apostles really sign their testimonies in blood? Nazi propaganda. The Nazi government of Germany ran fake news so effectively that the inhabitants of Berlin thought Germany was winning the war up until a few weeks before the city fell. So if you believe stories about the fantastic commitment of the apostles, then why not also believe the Nazis' clearly fake stories about winning World War II? Response: the stories of the followers of Jesus, especially the leading followers, is very similar to the stories of the Nazis. Well, it is similar in a certain sense. Specifically, the Christians told stories about themselves. Both the apostles of Jesus and later followers claim some of the apostles were martyrs. The Nazis also told stories about themselves. They claimed to be winning World War II when they really were not. Furthermore, both groups had their stories criticized by outsiders. Therefore, Christians spilled a lot of ink in defending Christianity, and Nazis did the same. One of the key things we know about history is the point of view of an author. When an author tells a story, she must choose certain things to put in the story and leave others out. What is chosen must be informed by the author's point of view. Thus, while we have room to question the truthfulness of a historical account, we have more reliable knowledge of the ancient author's point of view. And this is precisely where the Nazis differ from the Christians. The Nazis forced victims in their death camps to write happy postcards to home. They were forced to claim that they were having a wonderful time in the government protection camps. Therefore, we can see that the Nazis were careful to refute criticism of their mass murdering operation. This indicates to us the Nazi point of view. They saw the issue as important enough to debunk. They thought rumors of mass murder camps existed. When it comes to the ancient defenses of Christianity, things are very different on the issue of the deaths of the apostles. Christians respond to all sorts of claims about the honesty of Jesus, Peter, Paul, all Christian writings, or even Mary's sexual purity. But they never, ever, not once bother to refute any claims that the apostles denied Jesus to avoid death. They never bother to refute claims that the apostles were never executed at all. This is a giant difference between the two cases. It would be like the Nazis never doing anything to cover up the rumors of the death camps. The stories of the apostles' deaths are told, but never defended. This indicates to us that nobody ever challenged the story. Joseph Stalin's rewriting of history. When Joseph Stalin became the absolute dictator of the Soviet Empire Union, he rewrote history. He had historical documents altered, and some were totally suppressed. His objective was to increase his political power by making important figures who came before him vanish. For example, Nikolai Yezhov was a commissar of internal affairs as well as a political and ideological leader. He oversaw the arrest of 1.3 million people in 2 years. He eventually fell out of Stalin's favor and was executed. Then he was skillfully erased from photos of he and Stalin together. This made it appear as though he hadn't been the important leader, which in reality he was. Therefore, there was no powerful leader to rally behind other than Stalin. No story exists today of the apostles' death other than their signing their testimonies in blood. So since Stalin managed to erase the story of Nikolai Yezhov, then why do you not also believe that he was never an important leader in the USSR? Response. Stories of Nikolai Yezhov didn't vanish, even though Stalin wanted them to. We have the original photos to demonstrate that it happened. Someone like Yezhov, who was a very important political leader, will still exist in many people's memories. While Joseph Stalin can modify photos in the 1930s, I'll safely assume he can't erase memories from human minds. Stories of Nikolai Yezhov obviously continue to exist. With the apostles' death, no alternative stories exist other than that they signed their testimonies in blood. Atlantis. Around 400 BC, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote about an ancient kingdom called Atlantis. Located in what was called the Atlantic Ocean in his day, the Atlanteans invaded Athens. They were repelled by the superior Athenians. Then, after falling out of favor with the gods, their island was sunk into the ocean. Plato is the only source for the existence of Atlantis. So if you believe the Christians' claims that the apostles were martyred, then why not also believe in the existence of Atlantis? Response. Plato is our only source for the existence of Atlantis. But there are alternative stories. In other words, his student Aristotle claims Plato made up Atlantis as an ideal city to demonstrate that his concept of Athens was superior. But with the apostles, no alternative story exists other than that they faced death on a regular basis. This is what Luke claims in Acts, what Paul claims in his letters, what the Gospel of John claims, and what later Christian writers claim. No alternative claim exists. And in defending the credibility of the apostles, no later Christians bothered to refute any claims that the apostles were not martyred. This is an important point. Think of how easily we can simply suggest today that the apostles were not martyred. So then why is there no record of anyone ever suggesting such a thing back then? For many defenses of Christianity were written, which clearly suggests there was a lot of criticism. Gnosticism. In the first 100 years of Christianity's existence, a type of Christian group called the Gnostics existed. There were a variety of these groups. Eventually, many Christians declared these groups to be heretical, which just means incorrect. Due to this, as well as other reasons, Gnosticism ceased to exist. For example, some Gnostic groups taught that it was wrong to have children. So for centuries, we only knew these groups existed because of ancient Christian writings that argued why the Gnostics were wrong. It was not until the 20th century that a lot of actual Gnostic writings were found buried in Egypt. We found out a lot about Gnostics that had been forgotten. And we're pretty sure some of what the anti-Gnostics wrote was untrue. So if the stories of the Gnostics could have been so easily lost, then why couldn't the stories of the apostles be lost as well? What if alternative claims where the apostles were not martyred did once exist but were lost? After all, many Gnostic stories and Gnostic doctrines were lost. Response: much of what the Gnostics taught and believed was clearly lost. For example, the Gnostic Gospel of Judas makes Judas Iscariot the one disciple who truly believed in Jesus. He was the only one in whom Jesus confided his true message. We didn't know about this because of anti-Gnostic writings. We only know from the rediscovered Gnostic text. So if not for this miracle find in the 1940s, we would never know this alternative claim about Judas and the other apostles. But there is a big difference when it comes to the followers of Jesus signing their testimonies in blood. The key to understand is that we don't merely look at an ancient document to see what the author said. We also look to see what the ancient author's overall point of view was. To understand this, imagine a hypothetical scenario. Imagine that we also found Gnostic argumentative writings to defend their belief that Judas was the best disciple of Jesus. We have nothing like that, but what if we did? All we have is the basic story from them claiming this. But what if they went so far as to write various books defending and attempting to prove this point? In that case, we can safely assume that somebody out there was disagreeing with them on this point. In the case of the martyrdom of the apostles, we have so many Christian writings defending the Bible, Mary, Jesus, Peter, Paul, etc. Never once do they bother to defend the notion that the disciples signed their testimonies in blood. It's just reported as a fact that isn't worth the effort of defending. As for the Gnostic claim that Judas was the best disciple, it's a different case. We have no writings where the Gnostics defended their claims. They just make their claims. If we did have writings where they defended their idea of Judas, then that would tell us that people at their time had an alternative story. Or, if we had lots of argumentative, defensive writings from Gnostics, but they left the claim about Judas undefended, that would tell us that no alternative story about Judas existed. Therefore, it would probably be true. As it is, in reality, we have lots of alternative claims about Judas. All of the Gospels and Acts claim that Judas betrayed Jesus for money. The story is so famous that it's permeated language and common culture. The martyrdom of Joseph Smith. The founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, was killed in Carthage, Illinois on June 27, 1844. His church gives one explanation of his death, where he is a martyr for his doctrines. But outsiders describe a power-hungry man who died accidentally while trying to save his life. So even if we do know the apostles were martyrs, what were they really martyrs for? Perhaps the Christians simply put their spin on why Peter and Paul died. Response: the key to understand here is the difference with Joseph Smith. With Smith, an alternative version of the story exists. He was mayor of Nauvoo, Illinois. He burned down a newspaper that wrote anti-Mormon articles. Warrants were issued for his arrest, so he traveled to Carthage to face a safer trial there. A mob attacked him in jail. He managed to shoot one of his assailants before falling out of a second-story window. He was taken up dead. So did he die for spreading his doctrines? Or did he die trying to save himself after being put on trial for his power-hungry ways? When it comes to the apostles, no other version exists than that they were martyrs. What is included in that statement is that they were killed for their devotion to Jesus and especially his resurrection. After the lives of the apostles, people certainly debated the details of what people like Peter and Paul really believed about Jesus. For example, the Ebionites claimed Jesus was only a man and the promised Jewish Messiah. The apostles supposedly said this too, which was proved by his resurrection. The Marcionites claimed Jesus was not a man at all and rejected all Old Testament prophecies. Supposedly the apostles actually taught this, which was proved by his resurrection. The Gnostics taught that Jesus was both a lesser God and a man at the same time. They said that the God possessed the body of a very moral man. The man was killed, but the God had already left his body. Again, the apostles supposedly believed this. Either way you shake it, no alternative story exists other than the one where Jesus is clearly a very exalted and revered figure, and the apostles were killed for this claim. Think of it from the perspective of the anti-Christian pagans. How easy would it have been to claim that the apostles died for money and land like Muhammad? Or perhaps they were saving their own skin like Joseph Smith. No claim exists other than the ones where they died for their teachings. In fact, the anti-Christian pagans did claim that the apostles were in it for the money. The book of Matthew says the Jewish Sanhedrin claimed something like this from the start. But there is no version of their lives and deaths other than the one where they faced death for their teachings, much like Socrates. The difference with Socrates is that they based their beliefs on observations instead of highly complicated logic. The details of what the apostles really believed about Jesus was a subject of centuries of debate. Over time, different groups held different opinions. Later generations came to see what was good in both and bad in both sides. So this is how the orthodox view of Jesus slowly formed. Different views continue to exist over increasingly detailed issues, and there are still differences today. Summing it up so far, the followers of Jesus claim to be eyewitnesses to his resurrection in their own writings. The claims about their willingness to die for what they believed are probably true. There are later accounts of the apostles' deaths that add in many details on how they died. These later accounts contradict each other, so obviously some, or perhaps all, of the later ones are wrong. But the earlier accounts just make the simple claim that the apostles constantly faced death. Either that or they just say that they did die. Furthermore, there are New Testament writings among these earlier accounts. They claim not only what the authors believed about Jesus, but what they also were willing to endure to promote this belief. As we have seen, their willingness to sign their testimonies in blood is probably true. It will be helpful here to quote an early account of the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, which is not found in the New Testament. But I encourage you to read Acts, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the Gospel of John, etc. Quoting from 1 Clement, chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 2, written from anywhere from 70 to 140 AD. But, to pass from examples of ancient days, let us come to those champions who lived nearest to our time. Let us set before us the noble examples which belong to our generation. By reason of jealousy and envy, the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church were persecuted. and contended even unto death. Let us set before our eyes the good apostles. There was Peter, who by reason of his unrighteous jealousy endured not one, but many labors, and thus having borne his testimony, went to his appointed place of glory. By reason of jealousy and strife, Paul, by his example, pointed out the prize of patient endurance. After that, he had been 7 times in bonds, had been driven into exile, had been stoned, had preached in the east and the west, and he won the noble renown for which was the reward of his faith. Having taught righteousness unto the whole world, and having reached the farthest bounds of the west, and when he had borne his testimony before the rulers, so he departed from the world, and went unto the holy place, having been found a noble pattern of patient endurance. Unto these men of holy lives was gathered a vast multitude of the elect, who through many indignities and tortures, being the victims of jealousy, set a brave example among ourselves. By reason of jealousy, women being persecuted, after they had suffered a cruel and unholy insults, as Danaedes and Dirce, safely reached the goal in the race of faith, and received a noble reward, feeble though they were in body. End of quote. In addition to that, I think it would be prudent to share a list of criticisms of Christianity that later Christian debaters argued against. This list comes from Origen's Against Celsus and is dated to 248 AD. He is responding to Celsus, an earlier writing roughly dated to 170 AD. The argumentative writings of Christianity begin a little less than 100 years after the lives of the probable deaths of Peter and Paul, and continue until today. As reported to us by Origen, Celsus claims that Jesus lied about his virgin birth because his mother was an adulterer. Jesus was really raised in Egypt and acquired some miraculous powers there. He says the Egyptians are still very proud of this. Celsus says that the Christians are lying about Jesus being born into the line of King David. He even makes a blanket statement that the writings of Christians are lies. He goes so far as saying that the ethical commandments of Christianity are nothing special and simplistic. He says that Christians have a rule that no educated people are allowed to join, and only foolish, ignorant people. He says that Christianity only spreads because these dumb people tell them the children when no educated people are around. Yes, he really says this. So why would he never ever, not even once, say that the Christians were lying about these public executions? He says that because God became the man Jesus, he must become a sinner as well. He says that the true God would never require his followers to stop from worshiping idols by taking part in public feasts. He claims that Christians believe in a ridiculous story of Jesus returning and cooking the earth with fire. He adds that the story of Noah's Ark is a ridiculous fiction borrowed from the Jews. He says that Christians hate each other and constantly lie about each other, never agreeing on their doctrines. He even claims that the entire idea of a sinful world makes no sense and that the true God would never allow that to happen. What are the odds that Jesus arose? This tells us that we have no good, reasonable explanation of Jesus' resurrection other than to say Jesus really did rise from the dead. Of course, the very notion that someone could come back from the dead is itself unreasonable. That just doesn't happen. But in the case of Jesus, whatever you believe, you have to believe that something happened that just doesn't happen. Whatever you come up with, you'd have to agree that something really improbable took place. Of course, what could possibly be more unlikely than a person returning from death? According to the natural way our world works, that's just not going to happen. But there's a catch. The followers of Jesus claim God raised Jesus. This changes things. Imagine a hypothetical scenario. Imagine that God created a world with only 1 million people who would ever live. Imagine that God intended to bring just one person out of the million back from the dead. So if you just guessed who it would be at random, odds are 1,000,000 to 1 that you guessed wrong. But let's say that you narrowed down your choices. Let's say that you know there are stories about 5 of these people arising from death. It is very likely that the one person is in that group. If you choose at random from that group, then your odds are now totally different. It's a huge improvement. Let's say that you narrow your choices even further. Let's say that you investigate the claims surrounding each of these 5 people. Let's say that in 4 of the cases, you have a good, rational explanation for why the claim would be false. But in 1 of the cases, you try, but you can't explain it away. In that case, guessing that the only person remaining is the one you are looking for would be pretty smart. But that would be a hypothetical scenario of 1,000,000 people with God bringing back 1. So now let's keep it simple and say that we have no idea if God ever intends to bring anyone back from the dead. In that case, we'd have to say that the odds are just unknown. Even if you narrowed things down in the way we talked about, you'd still have to give your odds a simple 50-50. It's just unknown. You might think that since you've never seen God bring anyone back, then God probably doesn't ever intend to. But that would be a false assumption. You can judge people based on their past actions. This is because people tend to stick to their character more than their plans. Every student plans to study and make good grades, but they tend to stick to their habits. But for God, habits don't matter. What God intends to do, God will do. God might intend to bring only 1 person back in all of history to make it more important. Or God might never intend to do so. What all of this means about Jesus is simple. Did God intend to bring Jesus back? We don't know, so the odds are 50-50. But what about any other explanation you come up with for what happened to Jesus? The odds are worse than 50-50. Therefore, the most likely thing that happened is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Review with Dr. Bart Ehrman's ideas. Bart Ehrman is an American New Testament scholar focusing on textual criticism at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He is agnostic about the existence of God and obviously not a Christian. In his book, How Jesus Became God, he lays out his theory of what really happened regarding the resurrection of Jesus. I think it will be useful for us since it touches on so many topics we have looked at so far. First of all, Dr. Ehrman is a staunch defender of the existence of Jesus and early Christianity. He argues that Peter, Paul, and Mary Magdalene experienced a bereavement hallucination after the death of their beloved Jesus. The group of Jesus' followers then interpreted this vision according to their existing beliefs about Jesus. Those beliefs are basically 2. Jesus is the promised Messiah who will rule Israel and militarily free their nation from bondage. And all of this is part of the end of the world when all mankind will be judged according to God's law. So the bereavement hallucination was interpreted as a resurrection of God's Messiah. This elevated Jesus to a higher status and was a sign of the coming apocalypse. The later deaths of the apostles is something Dr. Ehrman questions. Finally, he insists that any explanation one can provide, no matter how unlikely, is not as unlikely as an actual return from the dead. Response. Hopefully at this point you can more easily spot holes in Dr. Ehrman's proposed scenario. First, the existing beliefs about Jesus were that he was the Messiah and would therefore never be killed by the enemies of God, Rome. Second, hallucinations are the product of excitement and expectation, as we have seen. Dr. Ehrman is proposing a totally unique type of hallucination, where it comes without an interpretation. In other words, being the product of expectation and excitement means that a hallucination comes pre-packaged with its own interpretation. Bereavement hallucinations are always the result of the individual's desire to know that the dead person is safe and okay. So that is always what they affirm. Your loved one comes and tells you that she is safe and okay in the afterlife. Therefore, any interpretation after the fact, as Dr. Ehrman suggests, would be a reinterpretation of the hallucination. Imagine that Jesus really did become a ghost and tell the apostles that he was okay in the afterlife. But then imagine that the apostles decided to change their view of this event to one where he resurrected, defeating death forever. That is pretty close to what Ehrman is proposing. In other words, this is a scenario where the apostles simply make up the idea of a resurrected Jesus as a lie. The idea of the lying apostles is literally as old as the Bible itself. And of course, the problem with it is the fact that they committed their blood to their testimonies. Hopefully at this point you will readily see the other problems with Dr. Ehrman's view. Were the ancient documents altered before they came to us? For the final portion, we will focus on a question that for some is important, but for others it's boring and easily resolved. Were the writings of ancient Christians altered later on? This is how we date writings with accuracy and precision in modern times. Generally speaking, we have no complete copies of anything that isn't written on stone until around 700 AD, when the form of paper was improved. But we do have earlier complete copies that include most of the New Testament that date to 350 AD. Nevertheless, if you go all the way back to Jesus' time, the writings are still here today, but they're rotted. We only have fragments of copies from that far back. So how do we know the writings haven't been changed? First of all, we have thousands of fragments, not just of the Bible either. We keep finding the fragments in archaeological digs all over the world. These small pieces can be laid on a complete page, and we can see all of the words and letters line up. So if people change the text over the years, why on earth do we keep missing the change parts? We keep finding fragments. It's like we keep throwing fragments at a board as though they are darts. If the New Testament has been changed, then why do the darts keep missing the changes? That isn't likely unless the texts are not changed. To help us understand the concept of changes to the text of the Bible, let's use the example of map making. During the age when Europe explored the world, accurate maps were primarily made by Italians and English. Spain, which ruled northern Italy, had an economy that was crucially dependent on the import of precious metals from its colonies. Accurate maps were vital not only for an economy, but also for military strength. They were therefore carefully guarded, sort of like nuclear launch codes today. Because of this, map makers would sometimes create incorrect maps. They would mark these maps by making imaginary islands. Therefore, you could tell others how to know if a map is correct or not. Look for the imaginary island. This example illustrates for us one simple point. When lots of copies are made, then you can tell who copied who via the errors. Errors and changes from the original become the best way to tell who copied what. When it comes to the Bible, multiple people are making multiple copies in multiple places. Therefore, it is almost impossible for a change to the text to make it into all of the copies. The more copies you have spanning the centuries, the more reliable your knowledge about the original Bible is. When it comes to the New Testament, there are about 5,600 copies in the original language, Greek. These include completes and fragments spanning from 100 AD until the proliferation of the printing press around 1500. But there are also translations of the Bible into other languages, even dead ancient languages. Altogether, we find over 20,000 handwritten manuscripts. But there's more. Ancient Christians wrote a wide array of works about the Bible and quoted it extensively. There are enough quotations to reconstruct nearly all of the New Testament from these writings, dating from 100 to 451 AD. Once you understand these concepts, you begin to see the reliability of the text of the Bible. Imagine that some church in some place has always had the original copy of all of the books of the New Testament. Would you then feel more confident that it was really what Paul or John wrote? If you think about it, there would be more reason to doubt if that was the case. How do you know it was really written by Paul or John? What if someone way back when decided to make a new copy with a bunch of changes? How do you know that didn't happen? But let's say that instead you have thousands of copies spread all over the ancient world. Then nobody can change all of them. Furthermore, you keep unearthing new fragments that were lost. Do you see the point? To be clear, we have found many changes to the Bible text. We actually find tons of changes. We even find tons of changes between the later complete manuscripts. We find lots of differences in the manuscripts that span the centuries. There are more changes between the manuscripts than there are letters in the New Testament. But here's the thing. They are almost all unimportant mistakes. Spelling and punctuation errors are quite common. A tiny few of the changes are important mistakes. A few of them are important intentional changes and not mistakes. But none of them are really very important mistakes. In other words, none of them affect the core teachings of Christianity. Here's an example of a mistake. You are a scribe living in ancient times. You are copying a book by hand. You do this all day, every day for a job. You read one sentence, then you write it on the new copy you are making. Then you go back to the original, but you skip a bit by accident. This is one of the most common mistakes we find. The interesting thing is that these mistakes can be shown to exist because people are making multiple copies in multiple places. So if someone makes a goof somewhere, only the people who copied that goof will have it in their version. The goofs themselves are totally unique and distinctive. The other copyists in other places may make mistakes too, but they will make totally different ones. Since we have so many copies, we can check them against each other. Sometimes the scribe went back and realized he had made a mistake and left out a bit. So he wrote the missing bit in the margin so the next guy would add it in. But often scribes wrote interesting thoughts and notes in the margin that they didn't intend to be added into the Bible text. Sometimes scribes who just copied text all day for a living drew random scribbles in the margin. Sometimes they wrote dirty jokes. Actually, they just drew random doodles a lot. But there were times when the later scribe mistook a random note as something that an earlier scribe meant to be added in. In reality, it wasn't left out by accident, but rather a random thought. It could have been a sermon note, or who knows. Since sometimes missed bits were really put in the margin to be added in later, confusion sometimes happened. So there were times when later scribes accidentally added things in. There are even a few cases where the mistakes like this were made and they became popular and made into more and more copies every time. For example, The story of the woman caught in adultery from John appears in none of the manuscripts before the 900s. Then it shows up. Slowly it shows up in more and more of the copies. If you have a modern copy of the Bible, it almost certainly has a footnote telling you this passage probably isn't in the original. And please don't add this footnote into the text of your Bible. It's most likely that the texts of the New Testament were copied multiple times and spread around. For example, the oldest fragment is a copy of John that dates to 125 AD, which is 35 years after our best date for when John was actually written in 90 AD. This text was found in Egypt, so the New Testament was apparently copied and spread around pretty fast. If someone somewhere changes his copy, then how did all of the copies everywhere in later centuries carry the exact same change? In other words, you can compare all the later copies against each other as evidence that the text wasn't changed. The change in the text would only spread to the texts that are copied from it, and then from those, and so on. So the copies made elsewhere, which might have had totally different changes, would not carry the same change. But when we compare the copies, they all agree. That's unlikely to have happened unless the text was not changed. You might say that some big scary government burned all the other copies. But do you really believe that? Is it really possible to stop people from telling a story? There are a lot of attempts to do this that we know of from history, but we know about them because they just don't work. Christianity itself was a suppressed religion once. It doesn't work. At any rate, we have a lot of copies of the New Testament. We have thousands. We keep finding them. They are very accurate when cross-checked. Of all of the differences, no major teaching of the Bible is altered in any way. Stand to Reason Ministries says the New Testament has 99.5% textual purity, and that no non-Christian scholars debate this. It's not controversial. Furthermore, we can use radioactive dating on the early fragments and come up with dates for the actual fragment. But how do we know we can trust radioactive dating? We use cross-referencing. Handwriting styles change over the centuries. For example, in 1611, darkness was spelled D-A-R-K-N-E-F-F-E. So this is another way texts are dated. When the radioactive dating and the handwriting dating give us the same date, we can confidently say how old a document is. It's unlikely that the two methods would accidentally arrive at the same date. We also know that a document is most likely a copy of the original, therefore the original is probably lost and older. Furthermore, if a document fails to mention something that is really important to its subject, then the event probably had not happened yet. So the fact that Acts doesn't mention the deaths of Peter or Paul means they were probably still alive when it was written, even though our earliest copies may date to a few decades after they would have died. Since 2 Corinthians mentions 1 Corinthians, it is probably later and newer. But all scholars agree that 1 Corinthians is reliably dated to 55 AD. 1 Corinthians mentions an earlier visit where Paul taught the Corinthians to an easy-to-memorize creed. This creed in chapter 15 mentions the resurrection and death of Jesus, as well as listing many witnesses. Furthermore, it adds that many of the witnesses are still alive. It is unlikely that Paul would have said this if he didn't expect people to go talk to the eyewitnesses. He is inviting people to do this. Since Jesus' execution is also a well-known historical event with a mountain of well-dated evidence itself, this creed is dated to between 5 and 15 years after Jesus' death. Given this early documentation of the resurrection and witnesses to it, therefore it is unlikely that the story of Jesus' resurrection is a legend. Other components may have been added, but the core story is quite early, clearly. Mark gives an account of the resurrection that's dated to about 70 AD, according to the consensus of scholars. John also does this and is dated to 90 AD, or about 60 years after Jesus' death. So our knowledge of whether the ancient texts have been altered over time is reliable. This is especially true when we have lots of copies and different copying traditions back to the original manuscripts. Hello, this is Ben. If you enjoyed this video but you still have more questions, then check out my blog at benjoiner.home.blog, or you can check out other videos on this channel which hopefully are organized well enough into playlists where you can see them. And of course, you should be able to find linked everywhere my email, social media, and you can contact me however you want. Have a great day.